He had always known what I did not know, and when I learned it, I was always able to forget. But I did not know that then, although I learned it later.
Hey, this is Nick.
This is Eric.
Hi, this is Stephanie.
And welcome to another episode of the Books of Some Substance podcast, where today we're wrapping up Hemingway Fest 2018 with the 5th episode on the author. This time we're talking about A Farewell to Arms, which is a story of Frederick Henry, an American ambulance driver on the Italian front in World War I, and his ensuing romance with the lovely English nurse Kathryn Barclay. So the thing we've been talking about this whole time that we haven't really managed to fully crack, I think, is just the magic of Hemingway's prose. Talked about it in his short stories, but I think we still haven't completely nailed why, it reads like it does and why it's just so fundamentally great. So, Eric, kind of opening thoughts on how this Hemingway style of writing still kills it this much later.
Well, all good art at its core is alchemy, right? It defies often explanation. So we have to acknowledge that Hemingway is a great artist. His prose is of the highest order, right? And with that, I think it defies a little bit of deconstruction. Even if we could kind of come up with some formula, even the best writers in the room here probably could not replicate it. That being said, there are a couple things that come to mind for me. One is that Hemingway's prose is a reductive art. We've talked about in the past, or it has been talked about in the past, this iceberg theory of how much he leaves out, so it allows us as the readers possibly to insert ourselves in ways that maybe other writers don't let us. But I also think it's a lot about the beauty of the sentences and the way they're constructed themselves. Often when we read, we're looking for the meaning behind things, right? And sometimes in that quest, we forget that just the general form, the form of the way the words come together and make this meter and make this just sort of beautiful flow is a huge part of it too. And what struck me about Hemingway was how just beautifully the language and the sentences flowed. And I was also struck by how there are some long stretches of dialogue in this book, and I felt like I hadn't read a book in a while that had this. And the fact that he could sustain these long sections of dialogue in ways that just flowed just so beautifully and brought equal amounts of smiles and gasps and to my face. There's an artistry there that I don't think can be decoded, but certainly those two things to me are part of what makes it so great.
Steph, first impressions?
I also enjoyed, the dialogue between the characters, and I think what makes Hemingway's writing style so great is I'll reference his iceberg theory, which I'll read the Wikipedia definition real quick here for
Excellent
everybody.
Scholar,
yes,
well done.
Thank you. So very basic. Hemingway believed the deeper meaning of a story should not be evident on the surface, but should shine through implicity. And he does that. He does that through his dialogue. There's not a lot. There is some description, but it's mostly you learn a lot of things through the characters and how they talk to each other, but you don't always get their backstory. But what that makes the iceberg theory great is we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg, whereas there's the whole rest of this iceberg underwater that belongs to Hemingway, right? So I think how he pulls this off is his iceberg is whole. So he knows he has the whole story inside of him. So only through these implicit things that you get, there's still this background of info on all these characters that is alive within Hemingway that maybe some other authors can't pull this off because their characters aren't fully fleshed out or their stories they don't have the whole iceberg. Hemingway's the whole iceberg. Is kind of what I'm getting at with that. And I think that's what shines through his work is you don't lose, there's no awkwardness. Yeah, like
the dialogue of it, right? And just like his ability to sort of use that as leading, both plot and character development and like all that stuff. And kind of prior on some of his shorts where we had talked about his ability to like encode information into that dialogue. And it allows him to create this very streamlined, very stark, very concentrated style of writing that everything kind of almost has multiple dimensions to it. And I think that is, again, just we're sort of harping on his iceberg theory, if you will. But it's like the Chekhov thing, too. It's like you allow like these interactions to prove the point rather than saying what the point is.
Right. And by making it implicit and only giving you small amounts of information, that it leaves it so open to interpretation to so many different people. And I think that's how he was able to reach such a wide audience with his work.
Yeah, because I think that reductive art and those extended sections of dialogue also sort of collapse the distance between reader and the text. And so you feel like you're sitting at the cafe table with these people. There's an intimacy there that is very difficult as a writer, I think, to capture. And that's a huge part of Hemingway's artistry for me too, is this intimacy in which we feel so much a part of these characters, and that, you know, has to be because of this dialogue, this ability to just capture this lightning in a bottle, as if, you know, I was sitting next to somebody and listening to people talk, and they're my super close friends, and somehow I managed to capture that same feeling of intimacy that I have sitting with them in a novel about people that I don't know at all.
That's true. Yeah, so let's talk about kind of the degrees, or rather the directions of that intimacy, because one of the things I've found to be very intriguing about this is you have this main character, Frederick, but you have these interactions that he has with the priest. You have this interaction that he has with his surgeon friend, Rinaldi. You have, of course, the love story with Kathryn. And he almost sort of operates differently with each of them, but they all are sort of seeking an intimacy with him, right? And I think the first two are probably a great place to start, because they are very different, right? You have the priest who's been sort of given this kind of bag of having to operate in this environment where everyone is sort of antagonistic to him. He's the butt of all jokes. There's so much anti-religion stuff because of course, the existentialism of war. And somehow he finds this authentic relationship with Frederick. And at the same time, you have Rinaldi, sort of his surgeon friend who may or may not have syphilis. And he has this different kind of relationship. It's a little bit more of a, I guess we'll use the bromance term. It's got, all of his language is punctuated with baby on the end of it. And it's kind of talking about chicks. And there's, they're very opposing interactions of Priest and Rinaldi. But in both cases, you feel that it's a super authentic relationship. And I think that, again, that shows his ability to kind of encode that info in the dialogue. But also he's kind of getting at something where, the weight of the war makes people rely on these relationships and how important that actually is. And so, again, there's stuff buried beneath what you see on the page that you can start to pick apart in a ton of different directions.
Yeah, and how those relationships help you grow as a person. I mean, I think because the priest was pretty heavily used, or was in the story kind of in the first half of the book, but I don't think he was around at all in the second half. And to me, the first half of the book is just this instinctual Frederick in his conversations with the priest. Like there was the example where he went on, I think, some sort of vacation from the war.
He was supposed to go hang out with the priest's family.
Yeah, and the priest had contacted his family and they had set up all these things for him. And then he was like, oh, sorry, I decided to, do opium around all these other cities instead.
I was planning on doing that wonderful hunting trip that you outlined. That's exactly what I wanted to do, but it turns out it just didn't go.
Right. Yeah, I didn't get around to it. I meant to, but I didn't do it. And you just feel really bad for the priest. And I think the priest was kind of understood that, hey, this is a really young guy. He's in a really weird time in his life, not only time period to live in, but he's also, a teenager as well. And he has a lot to learn. He's very ego-driven, I think.
The actual Hemingway at this point, we think was roughly 19. So the character Frederick, based on that, you can assume sort of being a late teen.
Right,
and dealing with, all of the combination of the wartime stresses mixed with, you said he goes off and, does opium. Is it opium?
I thought that's what I read, but I could be.
Let's call it opium.
Yeah.
But he's basically going on a pleasure trip, right? And the priest is, again, sort of having this bag that he's dealt he has this relationship with Frederick, but at the same time, he's actually kind of very understanding of the real world,
Yeah.
And so he doesn't want to sacrifice that
Yeah. I mean, the priest just kind of says, you don't really know what it's like to love yet. To love is to sacrifice. He says something along those lines, which I think is very much a foreshadow.
That's true. It's very prophetic.
Yeah, of what will happen later.
I mean, what makes a good writer is probably three things in my mind, or at least three things. There's probably more. But one is this observational skill, which I think Hemingway has. He's very tuned in, I think, to how these different settings of, being in a mess hall, being in war, being on furlough, being with...
furlough. That was the word. Thank you.
Yeah.
You got it.
Being with Kathryn. His observational skills of the nuances of these relationships, I think, are quite... again, nuanced, and I think that's because he's also has a sensitivity, I think, to what's going on in terms of the wartime context and the different kinds of people that he's intersecting with, and the stakes, the existential stakes that we've talked about of being in such a context. And then the last part is that, this book was written, 10 to 15 years after he was a part of this, and his ability to kind of have some perspective and is able to sort of inject that into the story here, which might not have been there if he had written this in the moment as a reporter or a year later. I think all three of those things coming together and coupled with the aforementioned style that we talked about, is really what makes all these relationships feel very real and of substance. And I think what's an interesting point to maybe talk about is the difference. I think we didn't really get to I think there are some nuanced differences between the way he writes about the priest and writes about Rinaldi and writes about Kathryn. And I know for me, I was and maybe it's a product of the fact that I was sort of surprised to find such nuanced renderings of relationships between men in combat that didn't entail the usual macho, kill them all, let's, war stuff. I was very struck by how nuanced those were, especially in the context of when this was written in the late 1920s. And if maybe the relationship with Kathryn is still as nuanced because it feels a little bit more familiar, maybe that's the reason that I was maybe more drawn to these surprising, very sensitive, emotionally rendered vignettes of the relationships between Frederick and the priest and Rinaldi, as opposed to the much more central love story.
So did you find, this question for everybody is, did you find the central love story to be lacking at all? I know there's kind of, at least I perceive to be a little bit of distance kind of in the initial interactions between Frederick and Kathryn, but there's also this kind of grand evolution that happens, and it sort of starts out with her being, very open. It's like the fifth sentence of them talking together about how, she had a past love and they were going to get married and then he died. And to be that forward in this interaction so soon, to me, was very surprising, but it was very indicative of kind of where they were at in life. She had so much more experience than he did.
I was going to say, I think it's just the times, right? I mean, I think living in war, she had lost the love of her life. She was probably a bit shell-shocked. And here comes this other guy who's showing interest, and she's like, okay, well, I still have the ability to love, and maybe I need to, love for the sake of loving, because that's all there is to life. She had already reached the existential, it's my life, I need to do with it what I will sort of road or path in the fork in the road. So in some ways, I think I think she was a tutor in both life and love to Frederick or to Henry. Because the first half of the novel, I think Frederick, he was basically just trying to get in her pants, where in the latter half, he actually did love her and understood what it meant to love. But there was several times in the beginning of the novel where she was just like, I understand the game that you're playing. I'm not going to play that game. I know what you're doing, and we'll get past this.
Yeah. And I want to read one of those early interactions.
Yeah,
that's kind of one of my favorites. So it goes, I looked in her eyes and put my arm around her as I had before and kissed her. I kissed her hard and held her tight and tried to open her lips. They were closed tight. I was still angry, and as I held her suddenly, she shivered. I held her close against me and could feel her heart beating, and her lips opened and her head went back against my hand, and then she was crying on my shoulder. Oh, darling, she said, you will be good to me, won't you? What the hell, I thought. I stroked her hair and patted her shoulder. She was crying. You will, won't you? She looked up at me. Because we're going to have a strange life.
She's so wise.
She's like a soothsayer. She already sort of knows what's going to go down, right?
And it's a testament to Hemingway that even though the sort of gender roles of the time, I think he's definitely playing to type there, he manages to undercut it a little bit with a lot more, I don't know, sort of flesh and blood representations of Kathryn, in the sense that I think your observation is good, Steph, that she is more experienced and she's had more in her life than he has. And so, he has to transcend a lot more in the relationship between Kathryn and Frederick, because that's the sort of traditional story that we're used to, and probably even more so possibly in the 20s too. And so I think it's a real testament to his writing that even if the story on the surface feels familiar, especially as it goes through the novel, more and more layers are added to it in a way that by its conclusion, it feels a lot more special, and the ending feels a lot more earned and moving, because they feel like complicated human beings and not the traditional sort of roles that we see in stories like this.
Yeah, so I know it's probably also important to talk about just the backdrop of how war is rendered in this story. And so I know, Steph, that you had some comments on kind of just how matter-of-fact it is, how Hemingway writes about war, and how it's not glossy, it's not shiny, it's quite abrupt. And I think that sets a lot of the stage for the importance of the intimacy in these relationships.
Right. I thought it was interesting, so World War I happened roughly 50 to 60 years after, I think the last war that happened on that continent was the Crimean War. And a lot of the novels at the time had somewhat romanticized war. I think, courageous, brave, heroic, there's all these certain adjectives and things that are used in these older novels that Hemingway didn't want to employ, I think, because he wanted to, and I don't know if he did this consciously or this was just his, natural inclination towards war itself. But there was one quote when he was some guy was basically trying to give him a medal for going to the front and his axe on the front. And he says, tell me exactly what happened. Did you do any heroic act? And Frederick says, no, I said, I was blown up while we were eating cheese. I mean, it's just very... That's what war is. It's every day, like things just happening in life. And that's how Hemingway wanted to describe it. He didn't want to gloss it over.
Well, and that
something it's not.
That being a hero is sometimes just random.
Yeah, that too.
Exactly.
The randomness of war, I think, is a huge part of this.
That's the whole like Norman Mailer, like Naked and the Dead thing. The whole thing, it's just all of these like strategies. It just has nothing to do with anything. It's just how the coin.
And
lands.
Speaking of a book that it was probably very influenced by Hemingway, that even though Mailer is a much more boisterous, expressive writer, I think that there's definitely a through line between A Farewell to Arms and The Naked and the Dead. And I mean, upon rereading this, I mentioned to you guys that the last time I read this was in high school, and when we said we were going to read A Farewell to Arms, I have to admit I was a little disappointed because I'm a fan of a lot of the other books, and I always saw Farewell to Arms as like kind of the old-fashioned war yarn, Hemingway's early work,
So you're going to talk like that the rest of the podcast, right?
Yes, I have a lot of voices still to go
All right.
today.
All right, keep listening
to keep the 20s sort of screwball theme going. No, and I have to say I was a little bit like, Farewell to Arms. I remembered basically the ending, but it always felt a little bit old-fashioned to me is what I remembered. And there is a little bit of that here, especially in the dialogue. But I think what has changed for me in reading it now is that it is a very nuanced, probably revolutionary at the time, take on the war literature in the sense that it does pretty much undermine all these archetypes and ideas that I think were perpetuated about war at the time and probably after too, that to me were very sort of forward-thinking and points to a sensitivity on Hemingway's part, or at least a knowledge of the fact that war is more often than not this heroic thing as everybody purports it to be. And his sort of subtle, often very overt undercutting of that, I think, is part of what makes the novel so resilient as we reading it today. whatever those sort of stylistic or societal kind of things that place it in the times, it transcends that in the way that it looks at war, I would argue.
Yeah, it's funny, like this whole sort of arc of Hemingway episodes that we've done has sort of rearranged what my perception of him is. And there's a lot of stuff in there that's like, oh, I didn't realize Hemingway talked about a lot of controversial social issues. I didn't realize that he wasn't just this like strong-headed American guy that you typically see, on Google image searches with, shirts off and guns and drinking and all that like great stuff.
So many photos of it.
Note that we're doing one of those activities right now. We'll let you figure out which one. But
it's
anyway,
definitely the guns.
Yeah. But so it was a surprise to me that he had this sort of, you still get that overt, like, I'm Hemingway, I'm going to tell you how it is, but the mixture with the sensitivity and the futile feeling of war and his desire to kind of communicate that is such a big part of this. And I'll even like read one of the most direct quotes about it, which is, if people bring so much courage to this world, the world has to kill them to break them. So of course it kills them. The world breaks everyone, and afterward many are strong at the broken places. But those that will not break, it kills. It kills the very good and the very gentle and the very brave impartially. If you are none of these, you can be sure it will kill you too, but there will be no special hurry. And just this...
Goosebumps.
Woo, yeah. And like, he's just outlines this whole backdrop that explains a lot of, the interactions, and kind of I don't know if we would say Hemingway is a pacifist. I'm not sure politically like where he lands on that, because as Steph has done a little research on, we know that he had a boat to shoot German U-boats?
In Florida. U-boats. He had this boat, and the government gave him money to outfit it with machine guns and to search for German U-boats.
So we haven't fully nailed down what the version of Hemingway today would be. But he certainly, like, a major theme of this is just how war breaks everyone, right? And there's no way around it. It's random, kind of, back to the whole, like, precursor, Naked and the Dead. And it drives this just need for human connection, I think, because that's all that's really left.
We have this vision of this tragic end to Hemingway, right? That, he killed himself, and part of it, I think the story that I've always heard is that he basically was struggling with, I can't write anymore, right? And so for him, not being able to sort of really generate, words on a page is why live. But there's probably an argument to be made too that, as someone obviously as sensitive as he was, because it comes through on the page that he has a very nuanced, emotional, sensitive view of the world, to kind of reconcile that with what you see in war probably haunts many people, and many people have ended it the same way he has. And I think that, you can see that he's definitely trying to reconcile these things, but going back to the word that you use, Stephanie, that I love, this implicit, right? He's hinting at these things beneath the surface, right? And I think part of that is also just because that's what was expected of people in this time and through World War II, is that the stoic male persona, right? That we can't show emotion, that we can't show cowardice, that we can't show ambivalence in the face of such things. And you could argue that maybe a lot of Hemingway's work is grappling with this. And if we pair this book with The Sun Also Rises, which is a book about the aftermath of war to a certain degree, I see those two books as almost as a pair now that I've reread A Farewell to Arms, in the sense that, he's grappling with this constant push and pull of, war and peace, of sensitivity and stoicism, the sort of male archetype. He's grappling with that. And it's interesting that his image alone sort of, we kind of see it on the surface first as this macho thing, but when you begin to probe a little bit deeper, there's a lot more there than just that. And I think that his tragic end goes to probably the struggle between those two poles, created by probably his wartime experiences.
Yeah, he's a bit more vulnerable than I kind of expected coming out of the gate.
That was the biggest thing for me, rereading a lot of this stuff, is the vulnerability. I mean, I loved his work. I hadn't read it in maybe 15, 20 years, and it had always been sort of a North Star, especially the short stories for me. But that's really what stood out for me, was this unbelievable sensitivity that I think gets sort of forgotten or pushed back in our assessments of him, because his persona and his, image, his myth, really kind of almost overpowers the actual writing itself.
It is a myth of him. Yeah. You had mentioned this once in a previous podcast, but he's kind of like a lifestyle brand.
Yeah, exactly.
Which I found very true. But,
so I guess, we talked about being surprised by like the vulnerability and the depth of that. And we hinted a little bit about kind of getting into Kathryn and how she showed more worldly experience and was kind of almost forcing Frederick to evolve a bit, to get out of his youthful 19-year-old-ish mentality, we'll go with. But how well does Hemingway write the character of Kathryn? Because I think a common question we're asking now, with a lot of like the literature canon being written by white men. So how well does Hemingway actually write Kathryn? It's a tough one.
Question.
Yeah, I mean, we were kind of, in the beginning, definitely, it felt a little wooden, their dialogue between one another. Like, I would put myself into the shoes of Kathryn and imagine having the same dialogue with, my boyfriend, and it was just, I would just laugh to myself. And be
such a wonderful boy.
Yeah, it's all so simple, and I don't know.
You should try that dialogue with your boyfriend. It can make things really fun.
I bet it might work.
Yeah.
Things get awkward. Yeah.
I mean, I think your observation that maybe she's a little wooden is right. I think what's great about her character, she does feel like an equal to him in this book, to me. Like, she definitely holds her own. She definitely at least feels as, she doesn't feel like the diminutive sort of female sidekick to me. Like, I even though maybe she wasn't as flesh and blood as maybe one would like, and granted this is, again, more or less from the view of Frederick, so it's through his eyes to a certain degree. Mm-hmm. It always felt reverent. Like, I never felt like he saw her as like, I'm taking her home and bringing her to the parents, and, and it felt like she was his equal as much as she could, be rendered in that way at the time. But I just felt, for me, she felt like a strong character. I just think that maybe he fell a little bit short in terms of really being able to render her as flesh and blood as the character that is totally a proxy for him. And the reason I think maybe it's, he didn't quite succeed is because one of my favorite books of Hemingway is A Movable Feast, and it's basically these sort of nonfiction vignettes of his time in Paris during, and I think in between the wars, during the heyday of the sort of art, whatever the term is, when everybody, from Picasso to Gertrude Stein was there, and the way he rendered a lot of the recounted the women he was involved with and the women he observed, including Gertrude Stein, they were very flesh and blood to me. And maybe it's this kind of thing where we have to give him a lot of credit for really trying to inhabit a character as such, considering how male-driven, ego-driven he was as well.
I was going to say, maybe that's why the dialogue between Frederick and some of his male counterparts seems much more real, or has more substance,
to that.
Right, versus the dialogue between a woman, and because he's writing from the viewpoint of Kathryn, of a female, and it's more difficult for him. He doesn't know what that's like, so...
But, she's strong. It's like, we're going to get in this boat and we're going to row to Switzerland. She's like, great, I can row for a while too. It's like, she's no wuss, for lack of a better word.
There's the whole...
She's pregnant too, it's like...
There's the whole layer of humor to this thing, but the boat scene is perfect because there's like two very morbid, humorous things that like happened with Kathryn. And so I'll read them both. So one is in the boat scene when she starts rowing, and then Frederick says, Watch out the oar doesn't pop you in the tummy. If it did, Kathryn said between strokes, life might be much simpler. And so that's like, first off, like, whoa. And then the second one that I noted was after she goes to see the doctor, she says, do you think I ought to drink another beer? The doctor said I was rather narrow in the hips, and it's all for the best if we keep young Kathryn small.
That's very telling, actually, that quote, because
So-
that's spoiler alert. Should we do that right now?
I think we can
Forecasting
spoil alert
Yeah.
away.
or rather not upper
Ding, ding,
ending
ding.
Yeah.
of Farewell to Arms.
Yeah.
Just letting everybody know, if you either don't want to be sad or don't want to know the ending, it's a good time to stop reading the book and maybe stop listening to this podcast.
And pause. And we're
Okay,
back.
okay.
All right. Yeah, so I guess, but like both of those to me, they're like kind of like a good example of evolution of intimacy in a relationship where you get to be more humorous. You're joking about the thing. You're dealing with realities through humor.
And you
which
know
is-
each other's boundaries, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But-
And you
but-
can be honest with each other.
Yeah, but the question of is that humor written from a male standpoint, or is that something that a pregnant woman
That's true.
would
Would
have
she really
actually
say that?
ever
Well,
said?
let's at least give Hemingway credit for like imagining a female character that I feel is strong. You know, it'd be very easy to go like, oh, since he's the macho Hemingway guy, all his female characters are these sort of, passive, weak women. And,
Like Fergie?
Fergie from...
No, not from the Black Eyed Peas.
Oh, okay.
Fergie from
No,
the
no.
book. She's the friend.
Oh, right.
She's kind of the hysterical
That was
one.
an interesting character.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
I've
Yeah,
been
yeah.
waiting every episode to talk about the
Yeah,
Black
yeah.
Eyed Peas,
Okay.
so thank you very much for that.
Come
yeah,
on.
no, I was not even thinking of that. So.
Fergie was super
So-
interesting, though.
So that's you,
Yeah.
man. You went there all on your own.
But
Yeah, I
Frederick-
mean, she comes off. I mean, Kathryn comes off very strong, and let's give Hemingway a little bit of credit for that, even if she comes off a little wooden at times.
You were going to say
I just
about-
wanted to say Fergie was really interesting. Like, it was very telling about Frederick because there was one part where he tells Kathryn, he's like, she doesn't want what we want. Like, she's different. And Kathryn's like, you don't understand women at all. Like, you have no idea. Like, that's just her personality. But there's certain things in life that everybody wants, and you have. Yeah, it was just very interesting. He's
She
like,
said
you don't
she's
know
a
women.
seer or soothsayer, whatever the term you used earlier. It's
Exactly.
like, she's really
She knows.
She sees the future.
It's part of what makes her so strong. Yeah.
Yeah.
And whether that's love or admiration or just his ability to go, this character needs to be strong and flesh and blood. I know there's something to be said, especially in the wake of reading Sabbath's Theater before I had to bring it up.
You had
Sorry.
to.
Every time
You had
you
to.
talk about Toni Morrison, you talk
Philip
about
Roth
Philip
always
Roth, you talk
comes
about
up.
Hemingway, you talk about Philip Roth, you talk about Philip Roth, you talk about Philip
I
Roth.
wanted a hat trick. I wanted the hat trick. Come on.
It's like a Subway club
So,
card. You get
yeah,
to 10, you get a
exactly.
free novel.
Free Roths.
We love what we love. I'm not apologizing for it. Anyway.
So the
You don't have to.
I think of the group. This is on the topic of the ending. I'm the one who read it for the first time, completely fresh, right? And so we're talking about the beginning, like the dialogue of Hemingway and how he encodes a bunch of information, but also how he doesn't waste a lot of words, right? And so the ending, when things start to pick up steam, when they're rowing 35 kilometers across, a lake to get into Switzerland.
So intense.
And then basically she's in the hospital and she's going through labor, and we already spoiler alerted the hell out of this podcast, but as the baby is stillborn, and then as she passes away at the end, and it's this super stark, abrupt ending. I don't remember in the last couple of years like turning pages like that quickly. It actually was, on top of all of these subtleties of intimacy and a commentary about war. It's a book that you want to get to the end of. And I I finished the last page and was like, wow, that like knocked you off your socks.
Well, first, it's good to know that, because I remember, that's the one thing I remember from reading it before, was the ending, that stark, very sort of sad ending. And I was reading, I was going through those last pages like, oh my God, because I know what's going to happen. So I was like, going through them very quickly and feeling that tension. And so it's good to know that is there regardless of if you know the ending or not. So it's a real, again, testament to Hemingway's craft. I mean, I keep going back to this. To me, Hemingway's a lot about just old-fashioned doing the work and craft, right, of the way you write. And at the end of the day, It's really about how you put the words together into one big thing and keep editing and re-editing, and it's a real testament to him as a writer. But the ending is amazing, and again, it goes back to this idea of sometimes creating art is a lot about the reductive process, like not resisting the urge to be additive, resisting the urge to thinking more is better, right? And certainly we've been through these ages of big novels and big shows of art that people have done 300 paintings. And what I really love about Hemingway is that he has the courage to know that actually this is all you're getting. It's not about more. It's about me sort of stripping it away to the point that I'm only going to give you a little bit, and that's going to be the power. Not this, everything but the kitchen sink. Instead, it's barely a drop from the faucet.
It's quality control.
Yeah. But it also, what occurs, when I finished the book, I was like, but why? Why did he feel the need to have Kathryn and the baby die? Like, what was he trying to say or tell us, with that?
It's a good question. Was he saying something symbolically, or was it really just the emotional?
I don't feel like Hemingway ever tries to do things symbolically on purpose.
Or does he?
But at least he's trying to raise the question. I think the Stark ending does exactly what you're doing. It's like, why? And so I like that he is saying, this is life. You need to figure out why this is happening. And, whether it's this very bleak view of, the world as being this kind of inhuman, random place, whatever your answer is, I think the fact that he did not try to elaborate beyond the horrible thing that happens is what gives it its power. And for those of us who have looked at some of the other
that's
endings,
exactly what I was going to bring up. But he thought about it in some of the alternate endings, which is interesting on why he chose not to elaborate on it.
I mean, I think about sometimes when I'm a teacher and the students put up something and you want to tell them exactly what to do, and you have to pull back. Just let them figure it out for themselves. Let them figure it out for themselves. And I feel like in some ways this ending is exactly like that. I want to explain to you. I want to tell you how brutal the world is. I want to tell you how hard it is to bury somebody. I want to tell you how hard it is to mourn somebody the next morning after you find out. But I'm not.
It took me, was it 39 tries? Yeah. Was it 37,
39? Somewhere around there. Yeah. I can't remember the exact
number. Almost 40 attempts at the ending to get to that.
I would like to read my favorite ending. It's very short. It was called the Nada ending.
Reference to the prior short story that we did a podcast on, right?
Yes, with all the nadas. So it goes, that is all there is to the story. Kathryn died, and you will die, and I will die. And that is all I can promise you. Big gulp there.
Yeah. Big gulps.
But even that is too much, right? If you look at it now.
That's a good point.
That's very existential in your face.
And I mean, I don't know if you guys read it, but there's a 1948 introduction of the book, so 20 years after he's written this book, 30 after he's been in the war, right? And it was just this little sentence. He said, the fact the book was a tragic one did not make me unhappy, since I believed that life was a tragedy and knew it could have only one end. It's like
the old life is shit explanation.
Or
so Hemingway. Hemingway.
I
don't know. I mean, it's interesting that he's. So I kind of asked myself, is it the wars that caused this existential movement inside? Because existentialism was started, I'm kind of getting into the weeds here, but it was started before the wars, right? Like Kierkegaard and all these guys, Hegel. I think
they've been grappling with that forever, right?
Yeah.
It was post-World War I, though, wasn't it? A lot of that stuff came out. Because the World War I was like a giant chasm in the historical continuum, right? I mean, all sort of forms of art and literature and philosophy were changed.
But I feel like existentialism made its way into popular literature around the end of World War I. Like before, it was only philosophy text. I had a beer.
Thought we were doing the guns.
Thought we were doing guns. Yeah.
But now we're getting into sorry, excuse me, too many guns. But now we're getting into like Hemingway, who this is kind of somewhat of an existential ending, right? Like you have to live your own life. It doesn't matter what you do. It's yours to live no matter what happens, because life is life. And then, again, like there's other literature like Sartre or Camus or any of those guys.
Yeah.
Like they actually, instead of it being a text, they make it into some sort of story for you to read.
I mean, you can trace, like the origins of nihilism, right, into the origins, or rather the like putting up the definitions of existentialism through, the authors you mentioned, right? But I think people have been grappling with this whole problem of life for like, we'll call it a long-ass time.
Since we were here.
Yeah.
Well, I think what makes Hemingway special in the context of those authors is that he's a lot more ambivalent and not prescriptive. And I would argue that a lot of those other authors, because they were more philosophical, and I think a lot of this came out of World War I, where people got a lot more hardliner about here's what we need to do to make sure this doesn't happen again. And I think for Hemingway, for him, it was a much more human, singular, individual human sort of struggle. And I don't think he ever felt like that could be resolved. And maybe that's why his writing in this book still is being read today, because he's not being very hard line about it. He's just raising the question like, hey, this is what war does. Do you want to live with this? Is this what you want it? Is this what you want for the people who are fighting it and the people who are left at home and our societies as a whole? But he's not being prescriptive about it. And I think that's for me what the power is of his writing. Again, it's the implicit thing. It's sort of kind of giving you a little bit of some breadcrumbs.
I'm going to state the facts.
Yeah.
Right.
And I'll let you do.
And I'll let you kind of figure out. And that is what good literature, hopefully, for me anyway, is about. It's about sort of giving you the questions to ask, but it's up to you to answer them the way you want to. And that's, for me, that's the power of Hemingway. And now that I'm a better, closer reader, thanks to Books of Some Substance, let's plug us for a second.
Are you bragging about how good of a reader you are now?
No, I'm bragging about how good you guys
how very Hemingway of you.
No, you're a better reader.
No, it's you.
Okay.
I'm gleaning even more from the work, and I always sort of rue the fact that like I'm never gonna read all the books I want, but at the same time, I'm really anxious to go back into his work and revisit it. Whatever contemporary books that I never end up reading get sacrificed at that altar.
Yeah, you don't need new books.
Yeah,
stick with the old books. So do we think, let's just like do our normal thing, right? Almost, let's see, written in late 20s, or about 90 years later. Does this still hold up?
It's crazy. I can't believe it.
Time flies.
90 years. 90 to 100 years.
That's like more than 80, less than 100.
In the grand scheme of things, not much, but...
Yeah. So is this of substance in the year 2018?
I think it is. I mean, I think a lot of people can find relevance with just the evolution of the character Frederick, being a teenager, starting at the war, being very instinctual, starting to understand what it means to love somebody and to sacrifice oneself. I mean, I think that still holds true for a lot of people, even though it's in the context of war. I would consider it a book of some substance.
There it is. There's the answer.
Shameless plug there.
Because you get royalties every time a Hemingway book sells?
Yeah, you're going to give me $1 when we leave, right?
You didn't disclose that at the beginning of this recording.
Dang.
Always sales.
His reach is everywhere. I think the test of art that is resilient and stands the test of time is, for me, is it's still stimulating the discussion and questions that it did at the time that it was created. And you could argue that maybe it didn't even do that at the time it was created. But I think I said this before, that, A Farewell to Arms to me was always the kind of minor Hemingway, at least in my, very biased, uninformed view. And this book really kind of rose in stature for me because of the questions that it raises, but also the artistry of it, the formal artistry. I mean, we always get into like, what's the meaning and what is the question it raises? But, I just am bowled over by the artistry of his just sentence structure. And, there are some, trappings of the times in terms of the style. Like, who knew that we used to hyphenate tonight? But nonetheless.
I didn't even.
Yeah.
Okay.
You are a better reader than us. We didn't even notice.
Yeah.
The formal beauty of Hemingway's writing is still so. It still bowls me over. And that, too, is considering that we go through periods of style where certain sort of styles, whether it's visual or written, become sort of, archaic or not appreciated anymore. I am very bowled over by his style still.
And that's something I forgot to bring up earlier, but I didn't realize how beautiful the first chapter is. If you read it kind of as a poem, and you could actually, instead of being read as a novel, you could kind of put the sentences like in poetic structure. It's quite beautiful. And I think that's why why the first chapter is so short versus moving into the actual story.
Mm-hmm.
It's beautiful. I mean, even for being a terse writer with his dialogue, but that's still, it was,
it's
very
such a moment.
Yeah,
he was a capturer of moments a lot of the time too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's something to be said for just unadulterated beauty, and the guy has got it in spades in terms of the way he writes.
Yeah.
And, subject matter aside, that goes a long way. But the subject matter has to be part two, and I think that he delivers in that respect as well.
So I'm going to answer the question and go with yes, still of substance, shocker. But I think the kind of Hemingway as a whole, I think that's my biggest realization is just, even though we all showed up to tape this podcast with our shirts off and with our rifle collection and drinking beer, that it's actually, there's
1
a
out
sense.
of 3 ain't bad.
I do that like every day.
Right.
So
that's just a regular Saturday.
Exactly.
What's the problem here?
Yeah.
But I was just amazed at the sensitivity. I was amazed at, even though you can probably pick apart some of the descriptions and character development interaction with Kathryn. He really was almost 100 years ago seeking this sort of fully developed female character. I found a lot of descriptions of sort of social topics in some of his other complete stories. There's things on abortion. There's things on bisexuality, things I never really associated with Hemingway at all. I always sort of thought him as this kind of bootstrapping American exceptionalism figure. But he's exploring a ton of that stuff. And so I think A Farewell to Arms is a piece of that puzzle and an important piece. And it's probably in my maybe top 2 of the long reads. I think I'm now a convert in the person who vouches for the short stories is my favorite. But
me too.
I think I'm really starting to view him as a whole as this kind of important force. And I think I get it. I was ready when we started reading Hemingway to sort of bury him in a way.
Dismiss it, yeah.
To enjoy it and be like,
I was afraid, to be honest.
Be like, I dig it, I get it, it speaks to me, but it speaks to me because it's only representative of a single viewpoint, and I'm a male reader, and that's why I get Hemingway. But I actually found a little bit pushed by it. And it's not perfect, right? There's some things that, are certainly of the time, but I was pretty impressed. So I'm going to go with thumbs up. Thumbs up all around.
Thumbs up.
Yeah.
Thumbs up. So that's our vouch. Don't worry about what you think the Hemingway lifestyle myth is. You should still grab a copy, and I think you'll find some nuance.
A mighty nation's voice will reach across the year and fill the hearts of those who fight for liberty. A nation's prayers will help the weaker ones along and will strengthen them when everything.
And now we'll do the alternate ending where Steph argues that Farewell to Arms is her second favorite piece of wartime art, first being Top Gun.
There just weren't enough jets.
Highway